Community Learners Lecture Series sponsored by the CPLA Committee called Perspectives in Liberal Arts. And I'm thrilled that you're here. Thank you for coming. So this hopefully is one opportunity to fulfill what we feel is our calling at Spring Arbor, to gather together as students, staff, and faculty, and study topics of significance together, especially those that have to do with the liberal arts and also our Christian heritage and mission in the world. So I would like to say a few words about our special speaker, Dr. John Hawthorne, and I'm thrilled that he accepted our invitation. So first off, a little bit about his background. He's professor of sociology at Spring Arbor University. Been here since 2011, I believe. Graduate of Purdue University, PhD in sociology, and one day I'm going to ask you about Boilermakers and why they're significant. And I think it's a cool mascot, but I don't know much about Boilermaking. So Purdue, but I'm going to brag a little bit on Dr. Hawthorne. He's a humble man, but this man is unique here at Spring Arbor in so many different ways. He has served in administration before coming to Spring Arbor as academic affairs vice president, as a provost, and then as he's returned to the classroom to study or to teach, he's continued to serve our institution in so many ways, especially with his expertise in higher education accreditation. So I had the privilege of spending a weekend with Dr. Hawthorne in Chicago a couple of years ago, and this was a conference for our Higher Learning Commission accreditation process. And you know, we received another 10-year extension, and it was in very much large part due to Dr. Hawthorne, who wrote the argument. It was quite a document, I'll say that, looking at all different aspects of the university and how we are fulfilling our mission. And so I just want to say thank you once again, Dr. Hawthorne, for all of your work. So much goes on behind the scenes, and Dr. Hawthorne is a true servant. You may know his wife, Geraldine, teaches mathematics here, and Dr. Hawthorne has conducted quite a bit of research in the area of higher education and now more recently the millennial generation and younger evangelicals. What does the future look like? He's published a book called The First Step into a Much Larger World, the Christian University and Beyond, and currently is working on another book, and he'll be sharing material that he's developed through his research. And so the title of his paper today is Younger Evangelicals and Critical Participation in the Contemporary World. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. John Hawthorne?
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. In the midst of all my other stuff and the teaching, and I discovered the sociology. I'm in a bad spot. I discovered, which is a problem because my screen's over here. I discovered the sociology of religion as an undergraduate and as a subject area that fascinated me, and it is one of the things that motivated me to graduate school. One of the things that caused me to go to, well, I was already at Purdue as an undergraduate. One of the things that caused me to stay at Purdue because of opportunities I had and doing scholarship there that I thought was important, the networks and connections that they had. And went on to, my teaching career has been entirely, my teacher and administrative career has been entirely at Christian University, which means my research efforts are, I don't want to say it's a hobby, because that's not quite right, but it squeezes in the middle of all my other stuff that I do. And so I was very fortunate last semester to have received a sabbatical leave, and was able, actually from May of 2018 through December of 2018, to focus on a collection of projects that I've been working on, and seeing how I could string them together into an overall kind of picture of some changes I think are going on in the nature of evangelicalism, not exclusively around millennial evangelicals, but largely influenced by millennial evangelicals. So it's not just generational, it's both generational and perspective. And I'll talk more about that. So I'm gonna very quickly give you little snippets from several chapters of the book. As it's emerged, I was able, with the sabbatical, to get 6 chapters drafted, which would not have happened were I teaching, so that was good. I'm going to tell you some of the key issues of chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. Little bits of those, and try to keep it woven together as an overall theme of what I think is going on, as within kind of how we understand the evangelical world, particularly from a sociological perspective, which is the only one I know. So I begin with the notion that evangelicals get discovered. In 1976, which some people in the room remember 1976, in 1976, Jimmy Carter is elected president of the United States. And what makes Jimmy Carter unique in that regard is he was one of the first self-professed, born-again Christians to run for president of the United States. Not the first Christian, not the first religion. In fact, the history is pretty rife with that. But the first one to use that label. And all of a sudden, the media particularly, but not exclusively, sat up and said, what is this about? Who are these people? Right? And so you'll see here on the left that during the campaign, Newsweek magazine, there used to be weekly magazines that came in the mail. You actually flipped pages and read them. Newsweek did a cover story on evangelicals in the fall of 1996. Time magazine actually declared the evangelicals the people of the year for 1977, or sorry, for 1978. They announced in December of 77 they were the people of the year for 78. Right? So now evangelicals weren't new. Historians will tell you we can trace kind of the nature of evangelicalism back to early days with migrations here and there. There are key figures along the way that play a key role. The National Association of Evangelicals was formed in 1942. Christianity Today was birthed in 1956. They're not really discovered, but they were discovered as a popular social movement. They become a movement in the late 1970s and through the 1980s. And we're seeing, yet today, the impact, that distinction between who are real, there's still a discussion, who are real evangelicals, who are movement evangelicals, how do we understand what that looks like? And the notion that evangelical becomes a self-identifier for polls is fairly recent. And so we talk a little bit about that, maybe not too much. Okay, so this all happens in the late 1970s. The first really good sociological analysis of evangelicals happens in 1983 when James Davison Hunter from the University of Virginia writes a book called American Evangelicals. 15 years later, Christian Smith from, he was at North Carolina, then he moved to Notre Dame. He was actually here as a focus speaker, I will say 5 years ago. It all blurs, so somewhere back there. So both books were titled American Evangelicals. They have a different flavor to the books because their subtitles are really interesting to me. So Hunter's subtitle is about conservative religion and the quandary of modernity. So his focus is on the challenges that the modern world presents to evangelicals. That evangelicals need to figure out, well, what do we do with this? Where's our place in this kind of changing society? And one of the things that Hunter points to is a lot of the focus on worldview, a lot of the discussion about creating infrastructure so that we have parallel contemporary Christian music, and we have Christian camping, and we have Christian, they go back earlier than that. But that notion, Christian colleges, that notion that we're going to create these parallel images is in part a response to that quandary modernity. Now, between 1983 and 1998, we get the rise of what we thought of, what was at the time called the Moral Majority, the Christian Coalition, what we now call the religious right. By the time Smith writes his book in '98, Smith is arguing that evangelicalism is defined by this sense of being in battle but thriving. We are under attack. Our identity is tied up in not being them, because there's this tension that's going on, and we are trying to speak to what we do with that tension. Okay. That's the late 90s. A decade passes. And two more books that I want to talk about. Both come out in 2010. Robert Putnam and David Kimball. You may know Putnam's name from Bowling Alone. He also has a wonderful book called Our Kids that I've used in the past when I teach Short Form about the nature of kind of inherited inequality. But this was a major study that he and Campbell, who's a political scientist in Virginia, did on American religion. Gathered a bunch of data, but he makes the argument, they make the argument, that what we saw in the development of evangelicalism was what he calls an earthquake and two aftershocks. The earthquake, they claim, was particularly the changes in sexuality and family that happened during what we call the 60s. I explained in my class the other day, for those of you, like all of you, most of you who weren't here, the 60s actually runs from about the middle of the 60s through 74. So we call it the 60s, but it really wasn't. Nobody cared in 62. Nobody in 62 called it the 60s. So, but tremendous social upheaval. Tremendous change. The family, the workplace, the pill is invented, Roe v. Wade happens in 73. All these things kind of come along, and it says this world is changing. And what happens as a result is that the evangelicals say, we need to stop that. So the first aftershock is evangelicals and religious conservatives in general organizing around what do we do about this tremendous change in nature society. But there's a second aftershock that happens. The second aftershock happens primarily among the millennial generation, who finds themselves put off by the political adversarial, the political animosity going on between religious folks and others, and they don't like that kind of strident argument. And so essentially they're saying, if that's what's going on, I don't want to be part of it. So Putnam and Campbell, I don't know if I completely buy this argument. I think there's a lot more going on, but Putnam and Campbell argue that the growth in the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the growth in the nuns is in part a rejection of the first aftershock. I don't have time. I can tell you more. You can ask me later about why it is that I think there are other factors contributing to the growth of the nuns over the last decade or two, and why that trend is going to continue. That isn't just what they talk about, but it's important. By 2010, James Davison Hunter, the same guy from 1983, writes another book. And there was some other work in between. He wrote a book on culture wars in the 90s, which was kind of in the spirit of Smith. But by 2010, Hunter has changed his tune. Hunter describes in this book 3 approaches that religious groups have used to to address the broader question of what do you do with the society at large. And the three approaches he talks about are defensiveness against, which is largely the fundamentalist, many evangelical groups, where there's an oppositional stance. This is the Smith argument. He says that a second approach is the relevant to, which he argues is kind of, the stereotype, mainline. We want to be relevant, we want to be liked, we want to connect with what's going on in society. And the third option was purely from, which is kind of the Anabaptist, y'all do whatever you're going to do with politics, we don't do that. And not just the Amish, but the broader segment. And he says each of those has weaknesses, has proven not to be effective as a strategy for cultural engagement. So he suggests that what we need instead is something that he calls faithful presence. The major critique of Hunter's book that I and others can offer is he never actually manages to say much about what he means by faithful presence. I mean, I think it's a wonderful concept, but it kind of happens, we reject the first three options and say what we need to do instead is something like this, but he doesn't begin to paint a picture of what that looks like. So that's been my project over the last 9 years. What does that mean? How do we begin to get our heads around what faithful presence might look like? And so what I've come up with, and what is sort of the central thrust of the book, is a contrast between two different approaches to evangelicalism. And those different approaches roughly divide between the books that I'm describing. So there is, on the one hand, what I call bounded evangelicalism, which is informed by the early book from Hunter or by Smith's book, and what I call permeable evangelical, which is my attempt to try to flesh out what the faithful presence looks like. And the distinctions that you can see here speak to issues. I can't see that. The distinctions here speak to the core issues. So you can see really quickly from my first three little bullet points under bounded that there's this notion of separation from the world, there's a notion of parallel infrastructure, there's a sense of oppression from outside, and then an added dynamic that's been showing up in the literature, in the sociological literature, pretty profoundly since early spring of this year, is a focus on Christian nationalism, is a blend of religious identity and political identity. There's really interesting new book sitting on my desk that I haven't read yet, by a political scientist who actually argues that political identity is increasingly in front of religious identity. Margolis is On the other hand, what we have is instead of separation among, and again, I'm thinking about not exclusively millennials, but largely millennials. What we have is a sense of cultural engagement, not separation. We have engagement. What we have we have a high value on diversity. Data has shown for quite consistently that the millennial generation has a high commitment to diversity, and conversely has a low tolerance of what they see as opposition to various groups. And the only thing I would add to that is that Generation Z, which is behind all you millennials, except for we were very, very young, is even more so. They are technologically savvy. So a lot of what's going on with permeables is not limited to physical space. And we could argue whether it's performative or not, but it certainly is a notion that they are engaged in all various forms of social media. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone because that was a story I don't have. Sorry. And what I mean by Christian realism, I don't know that they would use that term. I'm borrowing it as shorthand from actually from Niebuhr, I'm sure he won't mind, that this is an ability to critique an institution without abandoning it. Right? So the realism is a matter of saying, I have these commitments. But boy, that news that's come out over the last week about the Southern Baptists is horrific. And somebody needed to address that, and if you don't know about that, that's kind of how that's what that looks like. Okay, so this is my kind of, this is my theoretical framework in terms of this is how I'm thinking about these two broad approaches to evangelical. So the obvious question that I hope publishers will ask, does this matter? How do we get at it? What does this look like? Now, I have two of the institutions that I've served over the course of my career were Olivet Nazarene University in Illinois and Plymouth Nazarene University in San Diego. And because of that, I've had connections with the Association of Nazarene Sociologists and Researchers in Kansas City, who is the research arm for the denomination. And because I had that history, I was able to write the person who's in charge of the research center and say, Rich, do you think you could get me the names and email addresses of clergy in the Church of the Nazarene who are under 40? And then I came back and said, that was really great. Can I have another list of names of clergy in the Church of the Nazarene who were somewhere in their 50s so I can do a generational comparison? So, now, I don't know what you know about the Church of the Nazarene. It is another Wesleyan holiness denomination, and as a holiness denomination, it has a long history of separation from the world. Movies and circuses were off limits. I mean, those were not allowed back there in the day. And there was a time back there where movies and circuses were allowed. Or certainly card games, pool table, all that stuff. Separation from the world. There's okay, I'll let it go. My point is, I'm dealing with leadership from a denomination that is known to be conservative. So my argument was, if I can demonstrate the existence of permeable evangelicals among Nazarene clergy, I feel pretty confident in saying they exist in the broader evangelical world. Right? So there were 2 email surveys that I did. As I say, one group under 40, one group somewhere in their 50s. They received mostly the same survey. The distinction that there were some changes in the 50s about how long you've been in churches and how long you've been in ministry. The 40s question was more limited than the 50s question. But in all the key questions, they had the same question. So, could I have done better with the response rates? Perhaps. I was ecstatic when I beat 25% on the millennial survey. I really was pulling for 20 on the boomer survey, and I fell short. But I'm 347. I have over 800 Nazarene responses, clergy responses. So I can go with that. I feel good. I mean, that's fine. So one of the key dynamics in separating bonded evangelicals was to look at ways of dealing with separatism. And I used 4 questions that spoke to, and I've got this stuff with me, questions later about specific. But there were 4 questions that I used to create my scale. There was a question on changes in society regarding sexuality, particularly same-sex marriage and transgender, and sort of asked what the church's response ought to be. And it ranged from a very traditional role, a modified traditional role, a modified welcoming role, and a very welcoming role. So there were 4 responses. I did not provide them with a, gee, I don't know, or the other, maybe, I thought of that question that we usually do. By the way, I was informed, I was told it was a good idea not to ask questions directly about same-sex marriage because it had been a point of contention among some older clergy and younger clergy. And people who were advising me said, we're worried that it will depress your response rate if you ask that question directly, so I try to ask it obliquely. Okay. 3 more questions. The church should be separate from the world. Society discriminates against Christians. And the church should, that Church of Nationalism is my shorthand, the church should support the country. I think it was an always word there. So the 5, the last 3 were strongly agree, strongly disagree questions that did have a midpoint. It's an undecided midpoint. And I added them together. And that gave me a scale that ranged from 4 to 19. And if anybody cares, I can tell you what the Cronbach's alpha is on the scale. It's quite as high as you want, but it's in the ball. So here's what I found. In general, most Nazarene clergy are bounded. That's not a surprise to me. 72% of the overall responses were bounded. I'm sorry, I skipped out the fact that it was a split between 12 and 13. So 62% of millennials, 86% of boomers fall in the bounded category, with the balance being over here. But you see, there's a shift there from 14% of boomers to 38% of millennials, which is I think, pretty significant generational move, even though it's still minority. So it's not like everybody is adopting the permeable evangelical frame, that's what I call it. But there's something happening there. Now, I also, just for fun, I kind of looked at those who were on the extreme end of both scales. So I looked at those who were between 4 and 8, which means that to get a 4, you answer the most traditional on all 4 questions. And to get a 19, you answered the most progressive on all 4 questions. So, interestingly, roughly 12%, give or take, of millennials are out there in the edges. A third of the boomers, 86% overall, a third of the boomers were what I consider extreme balance. I didn't keep working with the extremes. I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at the information to try to slice it and say, well, what's going on here? Because if they all prove to be, I arbitrarily split between 12 and 13, and everybody was between 12 and 15, then all I'm doing is capturing the middle and making a slight distinction between them. So that's what we're doing. So here's the same information in case you'd like to see pie charts and separated by generation. And what I would point to is what happens if you look at the 2 permeables. You can see it go from here to here, and with regard to what happens by generation. Okay, so what? So I wanted to say, all right, well, let's begin playing around with what this data might tell us. I have a lot of other data on this distinction. I'm not sure. I just cherry picked some stuff to say. I think this will tell the story. So, generally speaking, how do you see the changes that have occurred in society over the past 50 years? This is the first time I've used a scale question like this. I like the way it worked. So all I did was set the extremes on a scale of 0 to 100, and the respondent slides the ruler to the point where they think they would be. and then I did averages. So what I find here is that 45, that on balance, the bounded say, the change has been good, they score a 45. If 50 is some good, some bad, 45 is a little more bad than good. Right? On the other hand, the permeables have a 58. They see the changes as they're a little farther away than the midpoint. And so they're looking at the change in society as generally, not exclusively positive, but generally a positive. So even the way we deal with how society at large is seen begins to shift. Follow-up question was, how well has the Church of the Nazarene specifically dealt with these broader social changes? And you can see that the boundeds on the right score 55, which says, could be better, but we're above the midpoint. The permeables give them a 39. I did not do the busy chart that had all four groups broken out. I believe the number for millennial permeables is about 34. So we're looking at something significant here in terms of how they think about engaging the broader world. We also see this with regard to a question that I asked about how they work with the Bible in light of contemporary issues. This question sociology polling data on the Bible tends to be really good if you're talking about a broad population of the world. Not the world, the country. If you're asking kind of vague questions, I believe the Bible is, inerrant, exactly word for word the way it said. I believe the Bible is inspired, but may have some error, some issues with regard to science or a certain piece of history. And then I believe the Bible is a bunch of stories that were handed down culturally from a bunch of people, and then the Bible answer is, the Bible, a bunch of guys made up this thing, it doesn't really matter. I mean, now, for a religious population, that's not a good question. So I attempted to get at this by asking a question about how do they use the Bible with regard to contemporary issues. So, at 4i, the Bible means what it says. The Bible has to be understood in the historical context in which it was written. The Bible is culturally bound and requires selective reading. And some issues or questions aren't anticipated by the biblical authors, and interpretation is required. Now, even though I've got boxes on those, I'm really trying to just illustrate that there's an interesting combination of generation and frame going on, because the bounded permeables and the millennial, the boomer permeables and the millennial boundeds break down almost exactly the same. On the other hand, 26%, over a quarter of the millennial permeables took the most, I guess I would call it the most open option with regard to scriptural interpretation. And nearly 25% of the boomer boundeds selected the most traditional of the views of Scripture. There's something happening here in terms of how they're engaging in the broader culture, and even how they're using Scripture in service of that engagement in the broader culture. Okay? I could say more, but I need to move. So there was a question I asked, because this is really important. How important? So I've already done this chart. There's a pair of questions. It says, how important is it for you to be known as Nazarene, and how important is it for you to remain in the denomination? Now, there's a gap here a little bit on the permeables. I tend to put that category that people want to do ministry, and if they're known as Nazarene or not, it doesn't really matter. I attribute this to the rise of one-name churches. The Verge or the Expanse or Anyway, it's just the river. I don't try not to pick on anybody's particular one-name church, but you see what I mean? The one-name church, they have denominational background, but that gets backgrounded in service of broader ministry. I think that's some of what's going on. What I think is really interesting is the similarity of the commitment to the denomination, regardless of generation or frame. It says that even though these are differing positions with regard to how these Nazarene clergy are engaging the broader culture, pretty significant differences in how they're engaging culture. They are not looking to run away. They're not disaffected Nazarenes. They're in. And I think that raises really interesting implications for how, which I'll get back to, for how we manage those kinds of, those differences within a religious body, which we're not very good at. We collectively in evangelical circles. Okay, so that was chapter 4. That's the Nazarene clergy day. I also wanted to see how does this work in terms of understanding people who go through this transition from one to the other, from bound to permeable, especially among millennials. So I went through 7 memoirs written by nearly all of them are millennials. There's a couple who are kind of on the edge of actually, they might technically be Gen Xers, but I think they're early adopters to kind of a millennial frame. And I was I was simply going through their own story of where they grew up, of where they were, how they were, kind of how they were immersed in the evangelical world, and what happened along the way. How did they document? How did they talk about their shift? And I'm putting my words in their mouth, although I have, they've all seen drafts of my summary of their book, so with a lot of quotes, and I feel good about it. I'm going to focus only on one of these as an illustration. The story has, some of these stories differ a little bit, and I can tell you more about them if I have a chance. If you're interested, join me for lunch. I'll tell you lots of stories about kind of how people deal with this. But I want to focus on Addie Zierman because actually Addie Zierman was one of the first books that I found in this arena that really piqued my interest. And I actually did a paper contrasting Addie's memoir with Mark Driscoll's memoir from Marshall, which was an interesting kind of, the fact that I had to read Mark Driscoll's book for a paper shows the dedication that we have to true scholarship. So Addie, this book's called Little Mirror on Fire. And Addie grows up in a very, you would, in reading about her childhood, you would hear your childhood. Okay? It's very comfortable, very, very similar. Church, the book opens up with around the scene with the pole, actually opens up with Addie standing in the rain at Sea with the Pole to demonstrate her dedication. Even though all the other Sea with the Pole kids had already figured out it was raining, they were standing just inside the school doors and praying there, and she was standing in the pouring rain because she wanted to show her devotion. One of my favorite stories, not my favorite story, one of my favorite stories is what happens when Addie and her 2 church friends sneak into school early one morning to anoint the cafeteria tables. Somebody had said, they had heard at a gathering that anointing somebody kind of set them apart. So they thought we should do that. We will take the school for God and we will anoint the cafeteria tables. Now they didn't have any anointing oil, so they took Wesson oil from the kitchen and they spilled it on themselves, and it was a mess, and it was all this great stuff. I don't know if any of you know Teen Mania. That she was kind of in Teen Mania. She becomes eventually part of Teen Mania. The real part of the story is that she has a boyfriend who is rising in leadership in Teen Mania. And I'm just giving that story away. There's all kinds of dysfunctions about their relationship that come to his. He comes home for Christmas one day and tells them that the people that the group told him he really needed to break up. That kind of thing. So when you're young, that's not good. Skipping ahead, she goes to Christian college. She attends Northwestern in Minnesota. And when she gets there, she struggles to figure out how she's going to fit in. Her roommates seem very much more conservative than her. They seem somewhat judgmental. I'm sure there were other roommates she could have found at Northwestern, so it's not really a caricature of the college, but that becomes an issue for Addie. She kind of does what I've discovered is a fairly standard move from the front of chapel and then increasingly back in chapel over the years. I'm sure that's just her story at Northwestern, and never happens anywhere else. She meets her husband, they get married, he's in international business, they go overseas, they teach ESL for a while. And in ESL, they're surrounded by Christian people that they don't quite feel comfortable with. They come home because being alone, young marrieds, teaching English overseas was lonely. So they come home after their 1 year stint and try to connect up with the local church, and that doesn't quite work. And they're in a home church, and that has its own issues. And she struggles. She struggles with depression and doubt. She drinks too much. She really kind of, where's my place and what does church do? And yet finds herself re-navigating that space to figure out how it is that she can be part of the Christian community that she thrives. She really wants to be part of this, the life of the body, the life of the church. But she has to rebuild it in turn. So there's this gap between what happens in her upbringing, which I would consider to be very bounded, with what happens as she reaches young adulthood. This is my favorite story. I should be today. This is my favorite story. Addie is on as part of the Teen Mania group, she goes on a mission trip to the Dominican Republic one summer. And they're a drama troupe. Right? And this is one of the things that happened to drama troupe. And the quote that I have here is actually the metaphor I use at the beginning of this chapter to telegraph what's going to go on in all 7 of the stories. So, first of all, the leader of the drama group told her that God ordained you to be a mime, which is one of my favorite lines ever. You're in a drama group and God ordained you to be a mime. So, to be a mime, she's having the face paint put on. Any of your mimes in your other lives? She's having the face paint put on and she's lying there waiting for it to dry. And this boy comes by, Justin. Justin grinned. Then he looked quickly around. When he decided to coach, he was supposed to interact. Relationship. When he decided to coach this club, he looked slyly down at me and winked. And then he was gone. I lay there for a moment, and then for no particular reason, I began to laugh. The white paint on my face cracked in 1,000 pieces. Underneath, there was my skin, my face breaking through, touching the light. There is something about Addie's experience of saying, I was, at least as I'm using it, I was in this bounded environment. I knew the rules, I knew what I was supposed to do, and this moment happened, or series of moments. Sometimes it's crisis, sometimes it's relationship. Something happens, and who I really am shines through from the God. That's the metaphor. So she goes through the whole story. This is her reflection from the end of her book. And she's contrasted, not exactly, she does not use my bounded and permeable references. But she does talk about an old approach to faith, to evangelical faith, and a new approach. And she says, you could say the old stereotype is bad, that new evangelicalism is good. But then this is a simplification also, isn't it? If you learned anything over the last 15 years, is that the world is not made up of stereotypes, but of people, complex and real. While American evangelicalism navigates the changing spiritual landscape, your identity is also in flux. You are neither stereotype. You are edging across the spectrum, drinking wine and paging through the Bible. You are finished with most of the raging now. There will still be moments when someone says or does something that sparks some hidden anger, and for a few moments you will rant white hot over a past spiritual wrong. But then it will flicker and crumble away like ash. These are not people. Well, here's my conclusion. This is me from the end of that chapter on the 7 millennium memoirs. At the end of their stories so far, each of the memoirists has moved from immersion in the structures of boundary evangelicalism through a period of separation that results in permeable evangelicalism. The core of faith remains solid. Yet now it's more robust, more able to engage the complexities of the contemporary world, less trapped in political antagonism, and less dependent upon winning intellectual arguments with others. While critics may focus on the distancing from structures as evidence that they have left evangelicalism, and perhaps seem glad to see them go, the truth is more complex than that. Really, these 7 people have each found ways of exploring a pathway toward the next phase of evangelical life and post-Christian fellowship. That's really the larger project of the book. So, what does this mean? Here are my theoretical implications. The nature of religious engagement is changing, and so our assumptions about what it means to be evangelical must also change. Secondly, there is an interesting interaction going on between generation and faith. It's not solely the millennial generation. There are older folks who are asking these questions as well. But it is driven by the changes in millennial culture and how millennials are dealing with culture. And so my argument is that millennial permeable evangelicals are attempting to flesh out James Davis and Hunter's faith in Christ. And lots of illustrations I have of people who are doing exactly that, their approach to ministry in the city, house churches, all kinds of things. Key question. Can they change frames within structures that have a default setting for rigidity and separation? In other words, in other words, how can evangelicals manage an understanding of religious and theological diversity without losing a sense of shared commitment? If the focus is on shared commitment and not on boundary maintenance, we have a very different picture about what the future of evangelicalism looks like. What are the challenges for a school like Spring Arbor that is committed to a distinctive approach to Christian education while attracting students who are increasingly permeable evangelicals? There's research I could share with you if you want to do much, that just came out from some folks in the last couple of weeks that speaks directly to this issue. All right, so other than that, I attended, there was a conference, a gathering, sponsored by Rachel Hill Evans and Sarah Bessey, for 2 of my memoirs. They did a conference called Evolving Faith in Montreat, North Carolina, in October that I went to. They thought that they announced the thing was going to happen, and they sold out in a day with 140 people attending. And there were about 1,500 people by the time the thing actually happened. Flew from all the country to attend this thing. I stayed with people from who ran a camp in Washington, very northwest Washington State. Some people who, young Marians who were overseas for a long time, but now they've come back and they're living in Lubbock. I'm just trying to figure out what probably but that's another chapter of the book. One more thing I'll just tell you, there is I was telling Dr. Bilbo before I started, that one of the things I'm struggling with right now is there is a group that you can find on Twitter that are called ex-evangelicals. They're pretty angry. They're very dismissive. And they had a really nice, CBS did a really nice interview with them. I get their sentiment, I get their anger, I get their frustration. And yet, I'm confident they're not what I'm talking about. That there's a difference between them and other people who are either still in the evangelical circles but feeling uncomfortable, or just outside the evangelical circles, and if there was a welcome, they'd be back. So that's what I'm wrestling with right now is where am I headed with this, and what do I do with this group? It's got a lot of attention and a lot of social media play. And I think the social media play is an echo effect, but I'm still trying to figure it out. Okay, that was me rambling. I wasn't going to do that. And I've left us, I think, 7 minutes. And then, did you want to say that I'm going to go straight to lunch from here? So if you don't have an 11, if you have an 11 class, you don't tell me that. I won't be responsible. If you don't have one, I'm going to just go to lunch now. So if you want to hang out and chat in small groups, we can do that. But we got a few minutes.
All right, let's see, we may have questions, comments. We'll start with students and then we'll include everybody first.
Okay, so with the emergence of permeable evangelicals, would you say that the religious right is dying? And then is this necessarily a bad thing for the church as a whole and then for our nation politically?
Whoa. Can I take like a minute to answer that question? So, here's what I think is going on. I do think that the movement of permeable evangelicals creates a counter movement within the religious right, the strongly bound evangelicals. And I honestly don't know how that's going to wash out. I think we're going to have a significant period of religious conflict with evangelicals over the next decade. Maybe, we'll call it 5 years. I might be more optimistic in the back 5, because that's going to be attention. There's also, as I mentioned, the interaction between generation and frame. Part of what's going on is that the people reacting are older and on the back end of their careers, which is one of the reasons that I am arguing that if evangelicalism doesn't implode, which is a possibility, if evangelicalism doesn't implode, there is a possibility for this kind of reframing and reshaping in ways that I think would be very productive in terms of ministry to the broader world and in terms of faith and presence. So that's a very good question. Other questions?
Being in the Nazarene denomination, I was familiar with the data you were collecting. When you were talking about the nationalism in the country, knowing that some Nazarene churches are outside the United States, was the data you collected?
Data is only U.S.
Only U.S.? All right. I just wanted to
No.
check that.
Yes, I should have said that. Only U.S. because dealing with the, dealing with the international components of those, they have enough trouble doing like the General Assembly business, so it's, I need to limit the local cultural engagement.
Other questions?
Okay, thought experiment, that the evangelicals right now are playing out what's happened in the United Methodist Church and some of the mainline churches over the last generation. And so with increasing diversity, if you take out the interaction with culture,
Yeah.
that evangelicals won't know who they are. If you take out, basically United Methodists only interact with culture. They don't have an identity. Maybe separately as individuals they do. There's no unity identity there anymore.
And that is one of the larger issues, I think, within if I kind of go back to my first slide and talk about the evangelical movement, as opposed to the pedigree thing, which has a set of commitments that they identify with. I mean, there is the Baptist Memorial. There is the Baptist Quadrilateral, which counts for something. I happen to believe that the Baptist Quadrilateral has been narrowly interpreted, and we need a broader interpretation to be able to work toward that commonality, and not be drawing lines one against another. The other thing I would add about the United Methodist Church is it doesn't exist with evangelicals in the same. There's a demographic shift going on in both of them. It's aging, and it's aging rapidly, and that becomes an issue. The growth of the United Methodist Church that happened in the 50s and 60s was a growth in a particular form of Methodism, which was the country club, community organizing Methodism. And so you can track its bulge that happens early, or the culture changes and nobody cares that, going to church isn't necessary to get the bank deal for your business. So once those things go away, kind of reestablishing, I think if Methodism can rediscover, re-articulate its theological identity, and not its kind of connectional identity. Sorry, we're talking about this. If it can discover its theological identity as opposed to, or as superordinate to its connectional identity, there's a possibility.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
The same thing with evangelicals.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree.
Last quick question. All right.
Okay, so another question is that there are clearly different flavors, so to speak, of evangelicalism. Do you think that with this generational shift, it will allow for more unity and more accountability within the church, or do you think we're going to move further away from that?
I don't. I think there will be more accountability within evangelical churches in the coming decade, but it won't be for the reasons that I talked about. It will be because of the surfacing of abuse after abuse after abuse, and that evangelical churches have to say, well, okay, so how do we deal with this? What do you do with a megachurch pastor who is seen as the person who is the center of everything, who, as I said in class today, whose teachings we follow, which just annoys me to the end, because I think, oh, Jesus is teaching, this is me. That there is something dangerous about that focus on this one individual, the connection to consumers culture and celebrity culture. And I think we're going to find ourselves figuring out how to move away from that, because not just the Southern Baptist, this actually goes to Willow Creek, but the issues of Willow Creek and Willow Hydro say, well, you probably should have paid attention to this back there a decade ago. And I think there's going to be required some change. This is the difference between the ex-evangelicals and who I'm talking about. The ex-evangelicals will say, this is all stupid, it's all biased, it's all patriarchy, it's all misogynist, can't do anything with it, leave them behind, as somebody said with another one of their hashtags, empty the pews. My permeables will say, we've got to do something about the misogyny and the abuse and the power dynamics and the patriarchy of the evangelical church if we're going to make space for people in this modern era. That's a more hopeful stance. At least that's the one I'm clinging to.
Okay, you know, Dr. Hawthorne has been sharing why you may think we live in a bubble here at Spring Arbor, but we are a part of a bigger world that does impact us. And I appreciate Dr. Hawthorne for sharing some of the bigger context, historical, cultural, religious, and I am glad that you are here as well. Could you join me in thanking Dr.